Every week, a lot happens in Parliament. Debates rage, bills are discussed, and laws are introduced. So it's easy to feel like you don't quite know what's going on in the chamber. So we're lifting the lid and telling you exactly what happened this week in Parliament. This week we saw a debate on the cladding which caused Grenfell, an update on the Genocide Amendment, and some PMQ's drama. In the first story today, we'll discuss Monday's debate on cladding. This debate took place due to the 2017 Grenfell Tower disaster, where 72 people lost their lives due to a fire in a residential London tower block. The inquiry into the fire found that the external cladding on the building didn't comply with regulation and caused the fire to spread up the building. On Monday, the Labour Party used one of their Opposition Day motions to debate the motion that this House calls on the government to urgently establish the extent of dangerous cladding and prioritise buildings according to risk, providing upfront funding to ensure cladding remediation can start immediately, protect leaseholders and taxpayers from the cost by pursuing those responsible for the cladding crisis, and update Parliament once a month in the form of a written ministerial statement by the Secretary of State. It should be noted that while this motion does carry a vote at the end, as it's a motion not a bill, it's not actually legally binding that the government follows what's being suggested. Motions are often used to raise awareness of an issue, not to actually change government policy. Nonetheless, in raising such attention and holding the government to account, they may be inspired to change course in light of the arguments and evidence presented by the opposition. But this is usually for the government to decide for themselves. One of the sponsors of the motion, Thangam Debonair, started off by explaining how renters, homeowners nor taxpayers should be responsible for replacing the cladding. The burden should be on the dodgy developers.
Government ministers have promised at least 15 times that leaseholders would not bear the cost. But recently this language has shifted to say they shouldn't bear unaffordable costs, and there's talk of loans. Labour's motion calls on them to reaffirm and put substance behind their original promises to leaseholders. But neither should the taxpayer carry this. The government should pursue the dodgy developers, cowboy builders, manufacturers of flammable cladding through legal action. That's the polluter pays principle. And where laws need to be changed to make that easier, we should do so. There's precedent for this already in Australia. Many councils and social landlords as well are currently being stung for the costs of the remediation. They've been set two impossible tasks by government. Build to the building targets they've set, but at the same time carry out expensive fire remediation without passing the costs on to hard-pressed tenants. This must also change.
In the same speech, Debonair goes on to urge the government, despite the motion being non-binding, to follow the recommendations set out.
The government may say that Opposition Day motions are not binding, but that is actually up to them if they choose not to be bound by the sovereign will of the country's elected representatives in this House.
Some other MPs thought that the cost of fixing the cladding issue should fall on multiple parties though, not just the property developers.
It refers to building owners, and clearly where there's a contractual obligation for building owners to remediate, that's absolutely right. But as he accepts, lots of building owners do not have a contractual obligation, no legal obligation to carry out that work. Nova House in Slough, for example, the building owner simply gave it back to the local authority, who then issued service charges to the residents because there was no contractual obligation for anybody else to do the work. So we perhaps need to look at a wider community rather than just building owners to provide a funding solution for this problem.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend puts his finger on the heart, the nub of the matter, which is the complexity of the situation which we and those people who find themselves in this difficult situation have to grapple, and that is what the government is doing.
This issue of exactly who pays for the cladding was a common thread throughout the debate. Nonetheless, when the debate came to a close, the government decided to abstain on the issue, meaning that the vote passed with 263 votes to 0. With no Conservatives actually voting on the motion. It's unclear whether the government will actually follow this motion's recommendations going forward, but we'll do our best to update you on that. A couple of weeks ago on This Week in Parliament, we suggested that we might be revisiting an issue regarding an amendment put forward by Lord Alton to the Trade Bill, known as the Genocide Amendment. And, well, here we are, we're back on it again. When voted on in the House of Commons, the amendment sought to allow the UK High Court to label a country as guilty of genocide, which would then require the government to take another look at any trade deal with said country. This amendment was narrowly defeated, but this week the Lords addressed another similar amendment, again by Lord Alton, which would still give the High Court power, but instead asked the government to make arrangement for debates in both houses to set out its course of action in relation to the trade agreement. So it was watered down from its initial version, but it could still be very impactful. Anyway, the debate saw various speakers, one of the first being Conservative Minister of State, Lord Grimstone. He argued that while claiming the government are committed to working with Parliament on the most heinous crime of genocide, and to exploring options with Parliament in this regard as it relates to trade, that the courts would have a difficult time in proving anything.
So given the procedural and evidentiary difficulties, as well as the extremely restrictive nature of the international law regarding genocide, I have to say, my lords, that there is a substantial likelihood that any judge could find him or herself unable to make a preliminary determination on the facts before the court. And my lords, such a result would be a substantial propaganda boon for any foreign government accused, which could portray the outcome as vindication for their policies and undermine broader diplomatic efforts to bring them to account. And my lords, please dwell on that fact for a moment.
Lord Alton spoke for almost 25 uninterrupted minutes and reminds the House of the importance of acting on horrific injustices, which he hopes this bill will achieve.
Last week, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. As a young boy, Judge Thomas Grenfell was incarcerated at Auschwitz. He survived. Judge Grenfell throws down this challenge to each of us. The human mind is simply not able to grasp this terrible truth. A nation was transformed into a killing machine programmed to destroy millions of innocent people for no reason other than that they were different. If we humans can so easily wash the blood of our fellow humans off our hands, then what hope is there for sparing our future generations from a repeat of the genocides and mass killings of the past? One cannot hope to protect mankind from crimes such as those that were visited upon us unless one struggles to break the cycle of hatred and violence that invariably leads us ever more suffering by innocent human beings. This all-party amendment is a modest attempt to break the cycle of hatred and violence which will otherwise lead to more suffering by innocent human beings. It's why the House should support it. I hope we will send it back to the House of Commons for their further consideration, and when we come to vote, I will press it to a division, and my lords, I commend it to the House.
This issue has taken on additional weight this week, following a BBC report into the atrocities in Xinjiang. Many others, as you would expect, spoke out about the horrors of genocide, including Baroness Kennedy of Shores, who is also keen to express the need for the UK High Court to be empowered due to failings of international courts.
The Convention's protocols also envisage that the international courts would be the venue for establishing guilt of such an egregious crime as genocide. And so it should be. But of course, members of the Security Council, as we've heard, mentioned several times already, they block the cases and will continue to block cases going to the court by exercising the veto. China and Russia do not want nations to be held to account for genocide, or indeed for serious crimes of inhumanity, as it comes too close to home and their own misconduct.
Ultimately, the amendment passed 359 to 188, so the government will have to face the prospect of another Commons debate pretty soon. For our final story today, we go to Wednesday's PMQs, where there was a fair bit of tension between the two leaders. It began with a seemingly normal dig from the Prime Minister regarding the vaccination process, directed at Keir Starmer, to which Starmer took objection.
And all this, of course, is to allow us to get on with the vaccination programme. And if it had listened to the right honourable gentleman, Mr Speaker, we would still be at the starting blocks, because he wanted to stay in the European Medicines Agency, Mr Speaker, and said so 4 times from that dispatch box.
Keir Starmer. Nonsense. Don't let the truth get in the way of a pre-prepared gag. The Prime Minister knows I've never said that from this dispatch box or anywhere else, but the truth escapes him.
Before getting into the meat of his reply to Starmer's subsequent question, Johnson had some advice.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in respect of the Honourable Gentleman's last answer, may I advise him to consult YouTube, where he will find an answer.
The tension seemed to dissipate until the last seconds of PMQs, when Tory MP Mark Francis stood up with a statement which proved Johnson to be correct.
Mr. Speaker, if it assists the House, perhaps I could help to correct the record. On the 31st of January 2017, the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite told the House, as recorded in Hansard, why would we want to be outside the European Medicines Agency, which ensures that all medicines in the EU market are safe and effective?
Order. We're not continuing the debate. That correction will be on the record, but I'm not reopening a debate.
Starmer then stated that he misheard Johnson and thought he was referring to different false accusations. The debate supposedly carried on after PMQs, and there were reports of an angry altercation between the two after they left the chamber. To be fair, these reports have been denied by many witnesses, but the fact this became a story in the first place highlights the level of disagreement during the debate. Anyway, if you want to be updated with what happens in Parliament next week, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Or if you prefer to listen to the weekly updates, then subscribe to the Daily Briefing podcast feed, where you'll find daily summaries of the week's news events, and every Saturday, This Week in Parliament.